For over 836 generations, the Keepers of the Library Sanctus upon Terra have served as humanity's foremost record keepers and archivists. For millennia, the Keepers would spend their entire lives compiling and cataloguing mankind's various accomplishments, a task which, according to their own oral histories, was entrusted to them by none other than the Emperor himself. Despite this, however, the knowledge of the Keepers would, for tens of thousands of years, remain a secret to all outside of their order, with all of their records and findings being passed down to each successive generation through oratory and word of mouth alone. However, in 991 M41, a keeper named Kruglov, a man who by all accounts was the sole surviving member of his order, would choose to defy tradition and transcribe all of his knowledge to parchment, due to him being unable to find anyone he deemed worthy enough to act as his successor. This document, which would come to be known simply as the Journal of Keeper Kruglov, would reveal just how much information the Keepers truly knew, much to the shock and horror of both the Administratum and the Inquisition. Indeed, Kruglov's journal would not only chronicle the events of the Age of Strife and the Great Crusade, but also what truly happened during the Horus Heresy, the Plague of Unbelief, and the Reign of Blood. Not only this, but the Keepers had also managed to acquire knowledge relating to both the Red Thirst, one of the gene seed flaws of the Blood Angels chapter of the Adeptus Astartes, and the treacheries of Luther, the first of the Fallen, whose actions ultimately resulted in half of the original Dark Angels Legion turning traitor during the aforementioned Horus Heresy. But perhaps the most interesting piece of information within Kruglov's journal is in regards to those long-forgotten eras of human history which predate the formation of the Imperium of Man. During the Age of Man, a period of history otherwise known to the Keepers as the Golden Age, the man known today simply as the Emperor would, unheralded and in secret, begin taking steps to prepare Old Earth for what was described as the coming of mankind. Eventually, the Emperor will be joined in his mission by the first men of the Golden Race, beings that are otherwise known to modern-day scholars as the Men of Gold. These Men of Gold would then begin slowly spreading across the globe, instilling order and civilization upon the anarchy of nature. In time, the Men of Gold would give rise to another subsect of humanity, the second men of the Stone Race, or Men of Stone for short. These Stone Men, whilst described as being physically inferior to the Golden Men and lacking in any of their philosophical inclinations, would produce a variety of advanced technologies which would allow humanity to begin expanding beyond the boundaries of the Sol system and into the vast expanse of the galaxy. The influence of the Men of Stone would continue to grow over the millennia, while that of the Men of Gold, thanks to their ever-increasing reliance on the artifice of their successors, steadily decreases, and around circa M21, the Golden Age of humanity would come to its end. But approximately 5,000 years later, during the Dark Age of technology, the Men of Stone would give rise to another new race of beings, a series of true artificial intelligences known as the Men of Iron. However, the Men of Iron would ultimately rebel against their masters, leading to an apocalyptic conflict known within historical records as the Cybernetic Revolt. But following the culmination of this war, which resulted in the majority of the Men of Iron, including those still loyal to humanity, being destroyed or imprisoned, the various alien races of the galaxy, which had been held at bay by the sheer destructive potential of these constructs, began to grow more aggressive and brazen, almost as if they were punishing humanity for its earlier hubris. Humanity's once great empire would also irrevocably shatter with the onset of the Age of Strife, with Kruglov himself noting that there was no longer a singular race of man, only countless factions that warred against each other, as well as the innumerable alien horrors that stalked the stars. Kruglov would then go on to chronicle the rise of the Emperor and his efforts to unite all of humanity under his banner. However, a copy of the Keeper's journal would come into the possession of Adept Kronvold of the Adeptus Administratum, who quickly moved to accuse Kruglov of heresy, a crime that the latter would ultimately be found guilty of. But even with Kruglov's journal being locked away and effectively declared contraband, knowledge of humanity's distant past, including that of the mysterious Men of Gold and Men of Stone, continues to persist through word of mouth, even if such stories are often recounted in a more fantastical and allegorical manner. But while the Men of Gold and Men of Stone undoubtedly played an important role in humanity's development, it still remains unclear as to what these mysterious beings truly were. So just who or what exactly were the Men of Gold and the Men of Stone? In regards to the Men of Gold, seeing as they were described as having joined the Emperor in his efforts to prepare humanity for the future, it's likely that the Men of Gold were a genus of humanity called Homo Superior, beings that are otherwise known more informally as Perpetuals. These Perpetuals were beings that were, for all intents and purposes, immortal, boasting not only seemingly indefinite lifespans, but also the ability to regenerate from the most grievous of wounds, even from death itself. However, over time, the Perpetuals would begin to disappear one by one, and by the end of the 41st millennium, only a single example of their kind, aside from the Emperor himself, was said to remain in existence. The idea of these Perpetuals being the legendary Men of Gold is partially supported within the novel Saturnine. According to one such Perpetual named Erda, who reportedly first met the Emperor during the ancient past, at a time when mankind began constructing the very first cities upon Terra, many Perpetuals, herself included, would befriend or otherwise come to adore the Emperor and willingly chose to aid him in his quest in guiding humanity towards a better future. In time, however, many of the Perpetuals would choose to distance themselves or otherwise turn their backs upon the Emperor, as they felt he had grown far too arrogant in his desire to accelerate humanity's evolution, believing him to be no better than the petty warlords he claimed to be greater than. Despite this, some individuals, such as Erda and Malkador, the last of the Sigillites, would choose to remain by the Emperor's side, which ultimately resulted in the Emperor using DNA harvested from both himself and Erda to engineer a number of artificial Perpetuals to serve as his generals in preparation for his Great Crusade, leading to the creation of the beings known as the Primarchs. As we can see, there are certainly undeniable similarities between the stories of the Men of Gold and the Perpetuals, for not only were both stated to have followed the Emperor in the distant past, but both in time would ultimately fade into obscurity. In addition, the Men of Gold were stated within Cropius' journal, as shown within the 3rd edition Warhammer 40,000 rulebook, to be, quote, strong of mind. The reason this particular detail is so significant is that a number of Perpetuals, including the Emperor, Erda, and Malkador, were known to be phenomenally powerful psykers, boasting incredible willpower and exceptional mental discipline. As well as this, the fact that the Men of Gold was stated to have imposed order and civilization upon the anarchy of nature would also support the idea of them being Perpetuals, for not only did some of these Perpetuals join the Emperor in his mission at a time where cities were themselves a relatively new concept, but they actively helped the Emperor guide humanity from the shadows, or at the very least for a time. As a result, it seems all but a certainty that the Men of Gold were indeed these early Perpetuals. But what about the Men of Stone? While multiple theories and hypotheses surrounding the Men of Stone are known to exist, there are two in particular that have more substantial evidence supporting them than most. The first of which posits that the Men of Stone, much like the later Men of Iron, were themselves an artificially engineered race. However, instead of being robotic constructs, could it be possible that the Men of Stone were the precursors to a strain of abhuman that still exists today, specifically that of Homo sapiens rotundus, or as they are known more commonly throughout the Imperium, the Squats. The Squats of the Leagues of Votan, or Kin as they prefer to be referred to as, are a physically stout and technologically advanced race whose territory is situated close to the galactic core. While it is commonly believed throughout the Imperium that the diminutive stature of the Squats was simply the result of an evolutionary adaptation to a subterranean lifestyle, the Kin's own historical sagas state that their people had always been an artificially engineered race, one that was brought into existence as a result of cloning and genetic engineering rather than through the natural process of evolution. There may very well be some kernel of truth to these claims, as even today, the Leagues of Votann will engineer entire generations of kin with a variety of unique traits and characteristics, be they physical or even spiritual in nature, in order to fulfill specific roles within their society, with such modifications being known amongst their kind as clone skines. What supports the idea of the squats being the Men of Stone, or at the very least their descendants, is that according to the 9th edition Votann Codex, Votann, the very primal ancestor for whom the Leagues are named after, was an individual that was known not only by the moniker of the Gilded One, but is depicted in some stories as being not one, but multiple figures formed from gleaming gold. The fact that Votann himself was described as being either a gilded figure or a collection of golden figures would certainly appear to insinuate, if not outright confirm, that this being was indeed a member of the legendary Golden Race. Not only this, but the Men of Stone were also described as being exceptional artisans, while the Leagues of Votann, in a similar vein, are noted for being technologically advanced, especially when compared to other human or human-descended civilizations such as the Imperium of Man. In fact, the kin, unlike their distant human cousins, still have both access to and the capability to produce a number of technologies that the Imperium either struggles to construct and maintain, or have otherwise lost the ability to do so entirely. However, while the stories of Votann being either a singular or multiple golden beings do indeed support the notion of the kin being the Men of Stone, it's important to note that there are other legends regarding the historical Votann which depict him in an altogether different manner. One such fable regarding Votann depicts him not as a being formed from gold, but rather one of stone, or more specifically, a wheel of graven stone faces, which in turn would seem to imply that Votann was not a man of gold, but instead a man of stone. This then leads into the second possibility regarding the Men of Stone, in that they are none other than the very ancestor cores of the Leagues themselves. The Votann ancestor cores, not to be confused with Votann himself, are, to grossly oversimplify, exceptionally advanced and powerful supercomputers, which are so complex and intelligent that, to lesser minds, their capabilities appear to be borderline supernatural. In addition, much like the myth of the historical Votann, in where he was depicted as a wheel of stone faces, the armoured casings of the Votann cores are often stylized after a graven face, even if said face may not be actually carved from literal stone. But perhaps the biggest piece of evidence to support the idea of these ancestor cores being the Men of Stone comes not from the squats, but the other notable members of Votann society, the Ironkin. The Ironkin, much like the ancient Men of Iron, are a race of truly sapient and self-aware robotic constructs that, despite being designed to assist the squats in their day-to-day lives, are not treated nor regarded as slaves, and are effectively considered equals to their flesh and blood counterparts. The reason that the existence of the Ironkin supports the idea of the Votann cores being the Men of Stone, as opposed to the squats, is that the Ironkin were first constructed and are still constructed by the Votann even to this day. The significance of this particular detail is further emphasized by the fact that the Men of Stone, as mentioned earlier, were responsible for the creation of the Men of Iron and other similar such sentient robots. Seeing as how the Men of Stone gave rise to the Men of Iron, much like how the Votann themselves give rise to the Ironkin, then it's not unreasonable to assume that there could very well be a connection between the two. It's also worth noting that the Men of Stone were described as being physically inferior when compared to the Men of Gold, which could be alluding to the possibility that such beings may have been immobile constructs, albeit self-aware ones, that lack the ability to move, manipulate objects, or otherwise interact with their surroundings, although this particular argument is admittedly an incredibly weak one. Regardless as to what exactly the Men of Gold and Men of Stone truly were, the mystery surrounding them will no doubt continue to persist for generations to come, even if such stories are seemingly destined to be forever regarded as little more than fables and myths. What do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.